The autumn wind carried a bitter chill as Sarah Mitchell stood before the weathered cabin, her children huddled against her in the fading Montana light. The journey from Boston to Eagle Ridge had stripped away the last of her reserves, both financial and emotional. 3 months since Thomas's passing, and still the hollow ache in her chest felt fresh as an open wound. She clutched Emma's small hand tighter, feeling her daughter's fingers cold against her palm. "Is this really Grandma Helen's house, Mom?" Emma's voice betrayed a mixture of disappointment and curiosity as she stared at the dilapidated structure. At 8 years old, she'd already developed her father's analytical gaze. Sarah nodded, throat too tight for words. This inheritance, this stranger's home, was all that stood between her family and destitution after the medical bills had devoured Thomas's modest life insurance. The cabin's sagging porch and weather-beaten walls hardly resembled the quaint countryside refuge she'd imagined during the grueling 3-day train journey west. 5-year-old David buried his face in her skirt. "I want to go home," his voice muffled against the fabric. "This is home now," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to her children. The land around them stretched in all directions, 5 acres of overgrown fields bordered by dense pine forest and the distant silhouette of mountains. A far cry from their cramped Boston apartment, yet somehow more isolating than she could have imagined. The key trembled in Sarah's hand as she approached the door. Helen Campbell, a grandmother she'd never known, a mother her own mother rarely mentioned. The mysterious bequest had arrived via a Montana law firm's letter just weeks after Thomas's funeral, as if the universe had cruel timing. An escape when they needed it most, yet so far removed from everything familiar. The lock yielded with a reluctant groan. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light that penetrated the grime-covered windows. The cabin's interior, 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a sitting room centered around a stone fireplace, smelled of abandonment and forgotten memories. Yet beneath the neglect lay the bones of what might once have been a cherished home. "It needs a woman's touch," Sarah murmured, running her finger through the thick dust on the mantel. The familiar phrase, one Thomas had used when they'd first viewed their Boston apartment, brought fresh tears to her eyes. She blinked them away before Emma or David could notice. That night, after settling the children on bedrolls near the fireplace, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table by lantern light, counting their remaining dollars. The inheritance had covered their train fare west with precious little to spare. Tomorrow would bring the challenges of securing provisions and beginning the arduous task of making this shell habitable. Sleep eluded her as the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old cabin played counterpoint to the distant howl of coyotes. Morning revealed Eagle Ridge in harsh clarity. The small Montana mining town consisted of a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, post office, bank, and saloon prominent among them. Sarah felt the weight of curious stares as she guided Emma and David toward Jenkins' general store. Conversations halted when they entered, resuming in hushed tones that barely masked their subject. Martha Jenkins, a thin woman with sharp features softened only by the silver threading her dark hair, measured out flour with practiced precision. Her gaze lingered on Sarah's city clothes. "You must be Helen Campbell's granddaughter." "Sarah Mitchell." She extended her hand, acutely aware of her Boston accent among the Western drawls. Martha's handshake was brief and cool. Folks wondered if anyone would claim that place after Helen passed. Been empty nigh on 2 years now. Sarah gathered her courage. "I'd hoped to open an account, just until we get settled." Martha's lips thinned. "We don't extend credit to newcomers, Mrs. Mitchell. Town policy." The lie hung transparent between them. Outside the store, Sarah paused to collect herself, clutching the meager supplies her dwindling cash had purchased. A group of men lounged against the hitching post, their conversation carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Campbell land's cursed," one muttered. "Can't see why anyone would want it, especially a city woman with young'uns." "She won't last a month," another agreed. "That place has swallowed tougher folk than her." Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve, her eyes wide with uncertainty. David, too young to understand the words but old enough to sense their meaning, pressed closer to his mother's side. Sarah lifted her chin and walked past them, spine straight despite the weight of their judgment. Survival had never seemed so daunting, even during Thomas's long illness. At least then they had had neighbors, friends, a community to lean on. Here they faced not just the challenge of the land, but the barely concealed hostility of those who might have been allies. The following days established a grueling rhythm. Sarah rose before dawn to battle the cabin's neglect, scrubbing years of grime from windows and floors, patching the most egregious holes in the roof with materials salvaged from a dilapidated outbuilding. The children helped as they could, Emma displaying unexpected resilience as she tackled the overgrown vegetable garden, while David gathered kindling from the forest edge under his sister's watchful eye. A week into their new life, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the afternoon stillness. A polished black Ford pulled up before the cabin, incongruous against the rustic surroundings. The man who emerged stood tall in an expensive suit, his silver hair and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to deference. Mrs. Mitchell, he removed his hat with practiced courtesy. Richard Holloway, mayor of Eagle Ridge and president of our local bank. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I thought it time to welcome you properly to our community. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, conscious of her disheveled appearance. That's kind of you, Mr. Holloway. Richard Holloway surveyed the property with a calculating gaze that reminded Sarah of the Boston landlords who'd circled like vultures after Thomas's death. I see you're attempting renovations. Quite an undertaking for a woman alone. We manage, Sarah replied, feeling Emma press against her side in silent solidarity. Holloway's smile tightened. I've always had a fondness for this parcel. Belonged to my family originally, before the Campbells acquired it. The lie slid smoothly from his lips. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. $25,000, more than fair for land this remote. The sum, nearly 5 years' wages for a working man, momentarily stole Sarah's breath. With such money, they could return east, start fresh somewhere with actual opportunities for the children. A generous offer, she managed, for a worthless plot no one wants. Holloway's voice carried an undercurrent of impatience. Think of your children, Mrs. Mitchell. This is no place for a woman of your background. Something in his tone, the dismissal, the assumption of her acquiescence, sparked a familiar defiance in Sarah's chest. The same steel that had carried her through Thomas's illness and death, through the pitying glances of former friends who'd slowly withdrawn their support. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Holloway, but we're not selling. The words emerged with more conviction than she felt. Holloway's expression hardened. Perhaps you should consider carefully, Mrs. Mitchell. Eagle Ridge can be unwelcoming to those who don't understand our ways. He replaced his hat with deliberate slowness. The offer stands, for now. I doubt you'll receive better. As his car disappeared down the rutted lane, Emma looked up at her mother. Why does he want our house so badly? Sarah had no answer, only a growing unease that settled like a stone in her stomach. That evening, as Sarah prepared their simple meal, Emma's excited voice called from the backyard. David, come and look what I found. Sarah hurried outside to find Emma standing beside a circular stone structure, nearly hidden beneath years of overgrowth. It's a well, Mom, like in fairy tales. The well's opening had been covered with weathered boards, now partially collapsed inward. Sarah pulled Emma back from the edge, heart racing at how easily the rotted wood might have given way beneath her daughter's weight. Stay back, both of you, Titi warned, kneeling to examine the structure. The stonework showed surprising craftsmanship. Each rock fitted precisely against its neighbors without mortar, creating a shaft that descended into darkness. It's dangerous. We'll need to cover it properly. But what if there's treasure down there? Emma's eyes shone with the innocent wonder that had dimmed during Thomas's illness. Dad always said old places hide secrets. Sarah smiled despite herself. Thomas and his stories, fantastic tales of hidden riches and forgotten histories that had captivated their children's imaginations. She'd almost forgotten the sound of Emma's excitement. The only treasure we're likely to find is clean water, Sarah replied, though the well appeared long dry. That night, after tucking the children into the bedroom they now shared, Sarah found herself drawn back to the well. The moon hung full and heavy above the mountains, casting silver light across the yard. She approached the structure with the lantern, its flame flickering in the gentle breeze. Curiosity overcame caution as she knelt beside the opening, pushing aside the remaining boards. The lantern's glow penetrated only a few feet into the darkness below. Yet as she adjusted her position, something caught the light. a brief, unmistakable glint from deep within the shaft. Sarah's breath caught. Logic insisted it was merely water, or perhaps a piece of glass. Yet something about that momentary gleam awakened a feeling she'd thought buried with Thomas. Hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing. Sleep proved elusive that night, her mind circling back to the well, to Holloway's too generous offer, to the hostility that seemed to permeate the town. Were these pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see? Thomas would have spun it into one of his tales, finding patterns where perhaps none existed. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that something significant lay just beyond her understanding. Morning found her at Jenkins' General Store again, this time alone. The stairs felt even more pointed, without her children beside her. Martha Jenkins watched with barely concealed suspicion as Sarah examined a length of rope. "Planning on hanging yourself already?" The question came from a weathered woman examining canned goods nearby, her harsh laugh drawing approving chuckles from other customers. Sarah met the woman's gaze steadily. "Just securing our well. Wouldn't want anyone falling in." Martha's expression shifted subtly. "The old Campbell well? I wouldn't drink from that if I were you. Is there something wrong with the water?" Martha exchanged glances with the other woman. "That place is cursed, Mrs. Mitchell. Helen knew it. That's why she left." "My grandmother didn't leave. She died here," Sarah corrected her quietly. "After staying longer than was wise." Martha leaned across the counter, voice dropping. "The Holloway family doesn't ever give up what they want. They've had their eye on that land since before you were born." Sarah felt a chill despite the store's warmth. Why would they want 5 acres of neglected land? Ask yourself why the richest man in the county would offer good money for what you call neglected land. Martha straightened as the bell above the door announced another customer. "That'll be 75 cents for the rope." Sarah left with more questions than answers, the weight of unspoken history pressing against her shoulders. Back at the cabin, she secured the children with lunch and instructions to remain indoors, then gathered her supplies. The descent into the well would be challenging alone, but the need to understand drove her forward. She secured the rope to the sturdy oak that shaded the cabin's western wall, testing it with her full weight before approaching the well's edge. The makeshift harness she'd fashioned from Thomas's old leather belt cut into her waist as she lowered herself into the darkness, the lantern dangling precariously from her wrist. The walls of the well narrowed as she descended, the rough stone cool and damp against her back. 20 feet down, her boots touched the bottom with a soft crunch of sediment. The space was surprisingly dry, with only a small puddle of stagnant water in one corner. Sarah raised the lantern, its light revealing a circular chamber roughly 6 feet in diameter. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just stone, earth, and time. Then her light caught it again, the same metallic gleam that had beckoned from above. She moved closer, examining the northern wall where the stones fitted together in a pattern subtly different from the rest. One particular stone stood out, perfectly rectangular, while its neighbors were irregular. As she brought the lantern nearer, faint markings became visible on its surface, scratched with deliberate precision. Not letters she recognized, but clearly human-made symbols. Sarah ran her fingers over the markings, feeling the intention behind them. Curiosity compelled her to press against the stone, to test its stability. To her surprise, it moved slightly inward, accompanied by a grating sound that echoed in the confined space. Heart pounding, Sarah pushed harder. The stone yielded reluctantly, revealing a small cavity behind. Within lay a wooden box, its oak construction protected from decay by the dry conditions. No larger than a thick book, the box was bound with tarnished metal bands. When she lifted it from its hiding place, its unexpected weight suggested contents of substance. No lock secured the box, but the lid resisted her initial attempt to open it. Sarah examined it more carefully, discovering a clever sliding mechanism that released when pressure was applied to a specific point. The lid yielded with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the well's silence. Inside lay a collection of documents, carefully folded and preserved in oiled cloth. With trembling fingers, Sarah unwrapped the first bundle. The yellowed paper crackled beneath her touch, revealing a land deed dated 1925. Her breath caught as she read the name. William Campbell, granted 200 acres of land by the United States government. 200 acres, not the mere 5 she had inherited. The documents told a story that unfolded like one of Thomas's tales, yet this one bore the weight of historical truth. Maps detailed the original Campbell property, a substantial tract that encompassed not only her cabin, but much of what was now Eagle Ridge itself. Tax receipts, official correspondence, all confirmed William Campbell's ownership of land far beyond what Sarah had been told existed. The final item in the box caused Sarah's heart to stutter, a leather-bound journal with the initials WC embossed in fading gold. Opening it revealed precise handwriting, chronicling events from William's arrival in Montana in 1925 until August 1930. By lantern light deep within the earth, Sarah read of her grandfather's discovery of a significant silver deposit on his property in 1928. William had kept the discovery quiet, fearing the attention it would draw in a region where mining claims often led to violence. Instead, he had begun careful legal preparations to protect his family's interests. The journal detailed mounting pressure from three local families, the Holloways, Robertsons, and Pierces, who had somehow learned of the silver and presented falsified documents claiming portions of Campbell land. William had engaged a notary named Daniel Richards to authenticate the original deeds and expose the forgeries. The final entry, dated August 4, 1930, chilled Sarah to the bone. Meeting Jeremiah Holloway tomorrow to present Richards' evidence of their forgeries. If anything should happen to me, let the truth be found in the one place they would never look. Our own well behind the stone marked with the old symbols my father taught me. Helen knows nothing of this. Better she remain ignorant should matters turn dire. May God and history judge these men if they persist in their thievery. William Campbell had died on August 5, 1930, allegedly from falling from his horse during a storm. The official record suddenly seemed as substantial as morning mist. The climb from the well proved more difficult than the descent, the box secured awkwardly against her body as she pulled herself upward. When Sarah finally emerged into daylight, she found Emma watching with wide eyes from a cautious distance. "Did you find treasure, Mom?" Hope illuminated her daughter's face, the same expression she'd worn when asking if her father might recover, before the doctors had extinguished that possibility. Sarah clutched the box tighter. "Perhaps," she answered carefully, "but it's not the kind we can spend." That night, after the children slept, Sarah spread the documents across the kitchen table, piecing together a history her mother had never shared. Had she known? Or had Helen Campbell fled with her daughter, selling most of the land at a fraction of its worth out of fear rather than ignorance? The journal suggested William had kept his wife uninformed of both the silver and his confrontation with the town's powerful families. Outside, an owl called mournfully as Sarah reconstructed the boundaries of the original Campbell property using William's meticulous maps. If his claims were legitimate, the Holloway, Robertson, and Pierce families had built their fortunes on stolen land that rightfully belonged to her children, the last of the Campbell line. The enormity of this revelation settled over her like a physical weight. These weren't just powerful families. They were Eagle Ridge. Holloway owned the bank and served as mayor. The Robertsons controlled most businesses along Main Street. The Pierces operated the region's largest ranch. How could one woman with two small children challenge an established order maintained for 25 years? Yet the alternative, to ignore this truth, to allow the theft to stand unchallenged, seemed a betrayal of both William's memory and her children's birthright. Thomas would have fought, she knew with certainty. His voice seemed to whisper from the shadows. "Truth doesn't expire, Sarah. It only waits to be discovered." Dawn found her still at the table, a plan forming like the first tentative brushstrokes on canvas. She would need allies, evidence beyond these documents, and most importantly, time to build her case carefully. Confronting Holloway directly would be not just foolish, but potentially dangerous if William's suspicions were correct. The town library became Sarah's first objective. Under the pretext of researching local history for her children's education, she gained access to newspaper archives and county records. The elderly librarian, Miss Patterson, seemed less hostile than other townspeople, even offering suggestions for materials that might interest young minds. Days passed as Sarah pieced together Eagle Ridge's public history, finding curious gaps around 1930. The official account of William Campbell's death received only a brief mention, a tragedy attributed to bad weather and poor judgment. The subsequent sale of most Campbell land to the Holloway Mining Company appeared just weeks later, the price conspicuously absent from the record. Researching your roots? The question came from behind her, causing Sarah to startle. Samuel Green stood leaning on a cane, his weathered face creased in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. At 70, he represented one of the few residents old enough to have witnessed the events of 1930. "Just trying to understand my grandmother's history," Sarah replied carefully. Samuel lowered himself into the chair beside her, joints protesting audibly. "I was just a young deputy back then, 18 and green as spring grass." His gaze drifted to the newspaper she'd been examining. "William Campbell's death always struck me as peculiar." Sarah's pulse quickened. Peculiar how? "Man like William didn't fall from horses, storm or no storm." Samuel's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He rode better than any settler I'd ever seen. Learned from the Blackfeet," folks said. His gnarled finger tapped the newspaper. "And that road where they found him? Flat as a pancake. Strange place for a fatal accident." "Did anyone investigate?" Samuel's laugh held no humor. "Sheriff back then was Holloway's cousin. Investigation ended before it properly began." He glanced toward the library entrance, then leaned closer. "I helped your grandmother with some repairs after William died. Woman was terrified of shadows, jumped at every sound. Never struck me as grief alone." Before Sarah could press further, Miss Patterson appeared with pointed comments about closing time. Samuel rose with a significant look. "You do well to be careful what questions you ask in Eagle Ridge, Mrs. Mitchell. Some answers come at a steep price." The warning echoed in Sarah's mind as she walked home, the Montana sunset painting the mountains in fiery hues that matched her growing determination. She was no longer simply a widow seeking refuge. She had become an investigator, unraveling a conspiracy that reached across decades. That determination faltered momentarily when she spotted a vehicle parked near her property, a truck bearing the Holloway Mining and Development logo. It pulled away as she approached, but the message was clear. Her activities hadn't gone unnoticed. The children sensed her tension despite her efforts to maintain normalcy. Emma grew watchful, absorbing every nuance of their interactions with townspeople. David became clingy, his nightmares returning with new monsters that spoke in unfamiliar voices. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" Emma asked one evening as Sarah checked the doors and windows before bed, a new habit born of growing paranoia. "No, sweetheart, just being careful." The lie tasted bitter, but Sarah couldn't burden her daughter with the truth. Not yet. A breakthrough came unexpectedly through Margaret Taylor, a retired school teacher who approached Sarah after church services. The elderly woman had initially kept her distance like most townspeople, but something had shifted in her demeanor. "Your mother was my student," Margaret said without preamble. "Bright girl, Elizabeth Campbell, left with Helen right after William's death." She studied Sarah's face. "You have his eyes, you know, William's eyes." "Did you know him well?" "Well enough to know he wasn't careless enough to fall from a horse." Margaret glanced around the churchyard where parishioners lingered in small groups. "Helen came to me the night after it happened. Said she didn't believe it was an accident, but was too frightened to speak openly." "What happened to her?" Sarah realized she knew almost nothing about her grandmother's life after William's death. "Sold most of the land for pennies on the dollar and fled with Elizabeth. Said she'd rather be poor and alive than wealthy and dead like William." Margaret's expression softened. "I always wondered if they'd ever find peace. Helen never did. Wrote me occasionally until her passing. Always looking over her shoulder, poor soul." This confirmation of her suspicions steeled Sarah's resolve. She expanded her investigation, spending hours exploring the property boundaries described in William's maps, looking for physical evidence that might corroborate the documents found in the well. Emma, with a child's uncanny intuition, became her most valuable ally. While David napped one afternoon, mother and daughter explored the creek that marked the eastern boundary of their current property, once the center of William's larger holdings. "Look, Mom!" Emma's excited cry drew Sarah to a tangle of roots where the creek had undercut an ancient oak. Partially embedded in the mud lay a tarnished metal object, a spur, its rowel clogged with decades of sediment. Sarah extracted it carefully, heart pounding as she examined the initials etched into the metal. WC. William Campbell's spur, found nowhere near the road where he'd supposedly fallen from his horse. "Is it treasure?" Emma asked, peering at the muddy artifact. "Better than treasure." Sarah brushed soil from the spur's surface. It's truth. Further examination of the area revealed more damning evidence. The remnants of an old campfire, glass fragments from a whiskey bottle buried in the soil. Someone had waited here, perhaps drinking for courage before an ambush. William hadn't died on the main road during a storm. He'd been attacked on his own property, likely on his return from the confrontation mentioned in his final journal entry. As Sarah gathered these pieces of evidence, she became increasingly aware of being watched. Unfamiliar vehicles appeared on the rarely traveled road past her property. David reported a scary man looking through their windows while Sarah was briefly away gathering firewood. The silent pressure escalated when local merchants began refusing her business. The butcher claimed to have no meat available when she attempted to purchase a modest roast. The dry goods store owner suddenly couldn't extend credit despite her prompt payment of previous accounts. "It's like they're trying to starve us out," Sarah confided to Martha Jenkins during a rare moment of privacy behind the general store. Martha had gradually emerged as an unlikely ally, slipping extra items into Sarah's purchases and offering whispered warnings about town gossip. "They're scared," Martha replied. "You've been asking questions no one's dared ask in decades. Word spreads in a town this size." "But why fear the truth after so long?" Martha's laugh was brittle. "Because fortunes built on lies have glass foundations, Mrs. Mitchell. And the Holloway silver mine is still producing on what was once Campbell land." This information that the mine remained active changed Sarah's calculations significantly. The stakes weren't merely historical justice, but ongoing profit. No wonder Holloway had offered $25,000 for her property. It represented merely a fraction of the mine's value. Sarah made a decision. She needed professional assistance, someone with legal expertise and no connections to Eagle Ridge. Using the town's small post office, she wrote to Professor Thomas Wilson at Boston University, a historian specializing in Western land disputes, whom she recalled from newspaper articles Thomas had collected. Her letter carefully outlined her discoveries without revealing everything, requesting his professional opinion on the document's validity and potential legal standing. The risk of interception seemed worth taking. She needed to know if her case had merit before proceeding further. While awaiting a response, Sarah maintained outward normalcy while secretly documenting every relevant detail. She photographed the evidence using Thomas's old camera, developing the film herself in a makeshift darkroom created in the root cellar. The original documents remained hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. The wooden box returned to the well as a decoy should anyone search the cabin. These precautions proved prescient. 10 days after posting her letter, Sarah woke to the sound of breaking glass. Emma's frightened cry from the children's bedroom sent her rushing down the hall, Thomas's shotgun in hand. The weapon had seemed an unnecessary reminder of loss when they'd packed for Montana. Now she thanked Providence for its presence. A man's silhouette filled the kitchen doorway, illuminated by moonlight through the broken window. James Robertson, Edward Robertson's youngest son, known throughout town for his drinking and volatile temper. He froze at the sight of Sarah with the shotgun. "Just looking for some food, Mrs. Mitchell." The slur in his voice confirmed his intoxication, but the methodical way his eyes scanned the kitchen belied his casual explanation. "Didn't mean to frighten you." "Take one more step and I'll shoot." Sarah's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. The children huddled behind her, David whimpering softly while Emma maintained a protective arm around her brother. James raised his hands in mock surrender, alcohol failing to mask the calculation in his gaze. "No need for unpleasantness. Simple misunderstanding." "Leave now." Sarah kept the shotgun level. "And tell whoever sent you that breaking into a home with children is beneath even Eagle Ridge standards." A flash of something, recognition, perhaps, that she understood this was no random intrusion, crossed James's face before he backed toward the door. "You're making enemies you can't afford, widow woman." Some might say this town isn't healthy for outsiders who don't mind their business. After he'd gone, Sarah reinforced the broken window with boards from the outbuilding, then sat watch until dawn, the children sleeping fitfully beside her on the living room floor. The intrusion confirmed her suspicions. The families involved weren't merely concerned about old accusations, but actively working to intimidate her into silence or departure. Morning brought a summons to the sheriff's office, delivered by a deputy whose apologetic manner did little to mask his discomfort. Sheriff William Holloway, Richard Holloway's nephew, received her with artificial courtesy that barely concealed contempt. "Heard you had some trouble last night, Mrs. Mitchell." He leaned back in his chair, boots propped on his desk in a deliberate show of disrespect. "James Robertson broke into my home while my children slept." Sarah remained standing, refusing the offered chair. "I expect charges to be filed." The sheriff's smile never reached his eyes. "James claims he was invited for a late supper. His word against yours, I'm afraid." "My broken window supports my version. Windows break in storms." Holloway shrugged. "We had quite a win last night." The parallels to William Campbell's death, another accident too conveniently explained, weren't lost on Sarah. "Is this how justice works in Eagle Ridge, Sheriff? Convenient explanations for inconvenient crimes?" Something dangerous flashed across Holloway's features. "You do well to watch your tone, Mrs. Mitchell. Eagle Ridge takes care of its own. Those who stir up trouble, especially trouble long buried, often find themselves regretting it." He lowered his boots to the floor, leaning forward. "I'd hate to see those children of yours suffering for their mother's curiosity." The threat hung in the air between them, all pretense of civility abandoned. Sarah felt cold fear slide down her spine but refused to show it. "Oh, are you threatening my family, Sheriff Holloway?" "Merely offering friendly advice." His smile returned, sharp as a blade. "History is best left in the past, Mrs. Mitchell, for everyone's sake." Sarah left the sheriff's office with renewed determination masking her growing terror. The stakes had escalated beyond property rights to the safety of her children. Yet retreat seemed impossible. If these families would threaten children to protect their secret, what would happen to the next owner of Campbell Land who asked uncomfortable questions? Upon returning home, Sarah found Professor Wilson's response waiting. The historian expressed fascination with her findings and confirmed what she already suspected. The documents, if authentic, established a clear case of land theft and potentially worse crimes. He offered to visit Eagle Ridge within the month to examine the originals, bringing his expertise in authentication techniques. This promise of outside intervention provided Sarah a fragile sense of hope. If she could maintain their safety for just a few more weeks, professional help would arrive. She redoubled security measures around the cabin, reinforcing doors, creating escape routes, establishing hiding places should threats escalate further. Emma, displaying maturity beyond her 8 years, became her mother's confidant by necessity. "Are we in danger because of the treasure?" she asked one evening as they secured the windows before nightfall. "Not treasure, Emma, truth." Sarah knelt to meet her daughter's eyes. Sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable, especially when they've built their lives on lies. Emma considered this with the solemn concentration Thomas had so often displayed when faced with complex ethical questions. "Dad said the truth always matters, even when it hurts." "Your father was a wise man." Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, heart aching with both grief and pride. "But he'd want us safe above all else. Is that why you put the box back in the well?" Emma's question startled Sarah. She hadn't realized her daughter had observed that precaution. "Yes, sometimes we protect the truth by hiding it until the right moment." That night, Sarah wrote detailed letters documenting everything she'd discovered, addressing one to Professor Wilson and another to a Boston attorney who had handled Thomas's modest estate. She sealed them with instructions that they be opened only in the event of her death or disappearance, then hid them beneath the loose floorboard with the most damning evidence. 3 days later, returning from town with the children after a necessary supply run, Sarah saw smoke rising from the direction of their cabin. Her heart plummeted as their pace quickened, rounding the final bend to find flames engulfing the rear portion of their home. Neighbors from nearby properties, though nearby meant nearly half a mile in Montana terms, had formed a bucket brigade from the creek. The fire, while devastating, had been contained before consuming the entire structure. The kitchen and rear bedroom had suffered the worst damage, while the front rooms remained largely intact. "Lightning strike," explained Frank Turner, a rancher whose property adjoined the eastern boundary of Sarah's land. "Strange with no storm, but happens sometimes in these parts." Sarah recognized the lie but nodded gratefully for the assistance. Later inspection confirmed her suspicion. The fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, with coal oil accelerant still detectable in several spots. Not lightning, arson. Most disturbing was the state of her bedroom. Someone had systematically searched it before the fire began, tearing up floorboards and slashing the mattress. The loose board hiding her evidence had been disturbed, though the waterproof oilskin packet containing the documents remained undiscovered in the deeper recess she'd created beneath. The message was unmistakable. Leave or worse will follow. That night, Sarah made her most difficult decision yet. After putting the children to bed in the undamaged front room, she penned an urgent telegram to Professor Wilson, no longer concerned about interception. The situation had progressed beyond caution to immediate danger. At dawn, Sarah gathered essential belongings and the hidden evidence. "We're going on an adventure," she told the children, forcing brightness into her voice. "Because of the bad men?" David asked, his innocent question revealing how much he had absorbed despite her attempts to shield him. "Just for a little while," Sarah assured him, "until our friend, Professor Wilson, arrives." They didn't return to town, where questions about their departure would surely reach the Holloways quickly. Instead, Sarah guided the children through forest paths to Margaret Taylor's remote cottage. The elderly teacher welcomed them without hesitation, ushering them into a home filled with books and the comforting scent of baking bread. "I've been expecting you," Margaret said simply. "History has a way of repeating itself. Helen and Elizabeth sought refuge here too, before they left for good." Sarah felt momentary peace as the children settled into Margaret's spare bedroom, their eyes wide with the novelty of this unexpected shelter. For the first time since discovering William's documents, she allowed herself to consider abandonment, taking the children and fleeing as Helen had, leaving the truth buried in Eagle Ridge's blood-stained soil. The temptation lasted only until evening, when Margaret shared additional pieces of the puzzle from her own recollections. "William wasn't the only one who died that summer," she revealed as they sat before her fireplace. "Daniel Richards, the notary who authenticated William's documents, disappeared 3 days after William's death. The official story claimed he'd moved to California. No one questioned it at the time." "You think he was murdered too?" Margaret's expression turned grim. "I know he planned to testify about the forged documents in Helena that week. He never arrived for his train." She sighed heavily. "This town was built on buried bodies, Mrs. Mitchell. The question is whether you're willing to dig them up after all this time." Sarah thought of the well, of secrets hidden in darkness for decades, of justice deferred and crimes unpunished. She thought of Emma and David, of the legacy of fear that had pursued Helen Campbell to her grave. Most of all, she thought of Thomas and his unwavering belief that truth mattered above all else. "Truth doesn't expire," she whispered, echoing the thought that had come to her in Thomas's voice. "It only waits to be discovered." The next morning brought news that Professor Wilson had responded to her telegram. He would arrive within the week, accompanied by colleagues with the authority to investigate her claims properly. For the first time since discovering William's box, Sarah felt the weight on her shoulders lighten slightly. Professional help was coming. Evidence would be examined. Truth might finally prevail. As darkness fell that evening, Sarah stood on Margaret's porch, watching the distant lights of Eagle Ridge glimmer in the valley below. Somewhere in that town, the descendants of men who had murdered her grandfather continued to profit from their crimes, living respected lives built on a foundation of violence and deceit. "We will have justice," she promised the night air, her words carried away by the Montana wind. Not vengeance, Thomas would have disapproved of that, but truth, accountability, and the restoration of what rightfully belonged to her children. Inside the cottage, Emma and David slept peacefully for the first time since the fire, unaware of the gathering storm their mother had unleashed, a reckoning 25 years overdue that would shake Eagle Ridge to its core. Sarah turned from the darkness, drawn back to the warmth and light of Margaret's home, to the future she would build from the ashes of revelation. The well had yielded its secrets at last, and nothing in Eagle Ridge would ever be the same again. Dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the peaks in hues of amber and gold that seemed to mock the tension coiled inside Margaret Taylor's cottage. Professor Thomas Wilson was due to arrive today. Sarah paced the worn floorboards, alternating between windows, straining to hear the approaching vehicle that would bring the first real ally to her cause. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, attempting to distract David with a game of jacks. The children had adapted to their temporary refuge with the resilience of youth, though David still woke crying most nights. Emma had taken to sleeping with her arm protectively draped across her brother, a small gesture that broke Sarah's heart each time she witnessed it. "Someone's coming," Margaret announced from her position by the front window, where she'd maintained a quiet vigil through the morning hours. The distant rumble of an engine grew steadily louder against the mountain stillness. Sarah gathered the children behind her as the vehicle approached. Not the rugged Jeep she'd expected from a Boston academic, but a polished government sedan. Two men emerged, a tall, silver-haired figure in a tweed jacket and spectacles, and a younger man whose crisp suit and watchful eyes marked him as something other than a historian. Margaret opened the door before they could knock. "Professor Wilson, I presume." Her tone carried the courteous formality of her teaching years. The older man nodded, removing his hat. "And this is Agent Robert Carson, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The introduction sent a jolt through Sarah's system. She hadn't expected federal involvement so quickly. Inside, as Margaret served coffee in chipped porcelain cups, Professor Wilson explained, "Your telegram raised concerns beyond academic interest, Mrs. Mitchell. The potential crimes you've described, land fraud, conspiracy, murder, fall under federal jurisdiction, particularly when involving multiple prominent citizens." Agent Carson's demeanor remained professional but distant. "Professor Wilson's reputation carries weight with our department. However, I should clarify that I'm here on preliminary assessment only. Until I've verified the evidence personally, this remains unofficial." Sarah retrieved the oilskin packet from its hiding place beneath a loose board in Margaret's pantry. The documents spread across the kitchen table represented 25 years of buried truth, yellowed pages containing the seeds of Eagle Ridge's destruction, or its redemption. Professor Wilson handled each item with reverent care, examining watermarks, comparing signatures, and analyzing the paper quality through a jeweler's loupe. His methodical assessment continued for hours, while Agent Carson took meticulous notes. The children eventually retreated to the back garden under Margaret's supervision, their whispered play a counterpoint to the serious examination inside. "These are unquestionably authentic," Wilson finally declared, removing his spectacles to rub the bridge of his nose. "The land grant bears proper Department of Interior seals from the period. The signatures match exemplars from my own research archives. Most compellingly, the geological survey notations in William Campbell's journal precisely match USGS records from 1928 that wouldn't have been publicly accessible." Agent Carson's professional reserve cracked slightly as he examined William's final journal entry. "This constitutes significant evidence of premeditation if Campbell was indeed murdered, as you suspect." "There's more," Sarah said, describing the physical evidence she'd gathered. The spur with William's initials found far from the reported accident site, the glass fragments suggesting an ambush. "And we believe Daniel Richards, the notary mentioned in the journal, may also have been murdered. His body was never found." The agent's expression hardened. "Claims of this magnitude against families of standing require substantial evidence before official action. We'll need to verify independently, interview witnesses, examine sites, review county records." "The sheriff is William Holloway's nephew," Sarah reminded him. "Most records are under Holloway control. Federal agents don't answer to local officials, Mrs. Mitchell." Agent Carson's voice carried a steel edge that provided Sarah her first genuine sense of hope. They developed a careful strategy. Professor Wilson would establish himself openly in Eagle Ridge, using his academic credentials as cover for examining historical records. Agent Carson would operate more discreetly, building a case while avoiding alerting the families involved. Sarah and the children would remain hidden at Margaret's cottage until preliminary evidence could be secured. "We'll need at least 3 days before taking official action," Carson explained. "Once we move, events will accelerate quickly. The element of surprise is essential." That night, after the men had departed for the Eagle Ridge Hotel, Sarah found herself unable to sleep despite bone-deep exhaustion. Margaret joined her on the porch swing, offering a knitted blanket against the mountain chill. "Helen sat right where you're sitting now, the night before she fled." Margaret's voice carried the weight of memories. "Terrified but determined to protect Elizabeth at any cost." "I won't run," Sarah whispered, the words a promise to herself as much as to Margaret. "My children deserve their birthright, not a legacy of fear." Margaret's weathered hand covered Sarah's. "There are different kinds of courage, child. Helen's was to flee when fighting meant certain death. Yours is to stand when the odds have shifted, even slightly, in your favor." The next morning brought Professor Wilson back to the cottage, his academic excitement barely contained. "The town records are a masterpiece of manipulation," he reported, spreading his notes across the table. "Selective omissions, strategic replacements, even entire pages rewritten with artificial aging techniques. Quite sophisticated for 1930. Can you prove the tampering?" "Definitively. I've documented inconsistencies in paper stock, ink composition, and pagination errors. The Holloways were thorough but not infallible." His eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of an academic puzzle solved. "Most compelling is what they missed. The county surveyor's office maintained independent maps showing the original Campbell property boundaries. Those records were stored in Helena, beyond their reach." As Wilson continued his investigations in town, Agent Carson pursued a different angle. Disguised as a mining investor, he gained access to property records at the county seat 30 miles away, building a parallel case that wouldn't alert Eagle Ridge's power structure. On the third day, an unexpected visitor arrived at Margaret's cottage, Martha Jenkins, her expression taut with urgency. "They know something's happening," she warned, after ensuring no one had followed her along the mountain path. "Richard Holloway called a private meeting last night with the Robertsons and Pierces. The sheriff's deputies have been asking about you all over town." Sarah felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "Have they connected Professor Wilson to us?" "Not yet, but they're suspicious of his interest in land records." Martha twisted her handkerchief anxiously. "There's something else. One of the old-timers at the saloon mentioned the well on your property. Wondered aloud if anyone had searched it properly." The implications struck Sarah like physical blows. If they examined the well, they might find evidence of William's hidden chamber. Perhaps even Daniel Richards' remains if her suspicions proved correct. The investigation could be compromised before it properly began. Margaret made a swift decision. "Martha, you'll take a message to Agent Carson immediately. Sarah, gather only what's essential. You can't stay here any longer." Within the hour, they had relocated to an abandoned hunting cabin deeper in the mountains, a place Margaret described as forgotten by all but the deer and myself. The primitive squatter offered little comfort but substantial security through its isolation. No road led to its door. The only approach required navigating a steep game trail, visible only to experienced eyes. Night fell with oppressive darkness, the cabin's single window revealing nothing but the silhouettes of pines against a star-filled sky. Sarah kept the children close, spinning elaborate stories reminiscent of Thomas's tales to distract them from their increasingly precarious situation. "Once there was a kingdom where truth slept beneath the earth," she began, the impromptu fairy tale echoing their reality. "A brave knight hid it there to protect it from wicked lords who stole what wasn't theirs." Emma, ever perceptive, caught the parallels immediately. "Did the knight have a granddaughter who found the truth?" "Indeed she did," Sarah continued, stroking her daughter's hair. "A clever princess who discovered that buried truths don't disappear. They wait for the right moment to emerge into the light." David, half asleep against her shoulder, murmured drowsily, "Did they live happily ever after?" Sarah's throat tightened. They had to be very brave first. The wicked lords didn't surrender their stolen treasures easily. Later, with the children finally asleep in the cabin's single bed, Sarah ventured onto the small porch where Margaret maintained watch. The old teacher's expression was grave in the moonlight. "I've been thinking about Margaret Hayes," Sarah said quietly. "William's former cook. She left these parts long ago. You mentioned she witnessed William's murder. If we could find her, her testimony would be invaluable." Margaret's silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if she'd misspoken. Finally, the older woman sighed deeply. "There are truths I've kept buried as well, Sarah. Some for protection, some from shame." "What do you mean?" Margaret turned, her eyes reflecting starlight and unshed tears. "Margaret Hayes never left Eagle Ridge. She simply disappeared into someone else." The admission hung in the air between them. "When Helen fled with Elizabeth, I remained to watch, to remember, to wait for the day justice might be possible." The revelation stunned Sarah. "You're Margaret Hayes?" "I changed my name, created a new identity as a teacher from Minnesota. No one questioned it. People came and went from frontier towns all the time. The Holloways were too busy consolidating their stolen gains to notice one Mexican housekeeper transforming into a respectable schoolteacher. Sarah absorbed this information, pieces clicking into place. Margaret's detailed knowledge of the Campbell family, her immediate willingness to shelter them, her unshakable certainty about William's murder. "You saw it happen," Sarah whispered. "You actually witnessed my grandfather's murder." Margaret, Hayes, nodded slowly. "I was gathering herbs in the forest when they ambushed him. Three men, Jeremiah Holloway, Edward Robertson, and Thomas Pierce, waiting where the creek crosses Campbell land. They beat him unconscious, then placed him on his horse and drove it toward the ravine on the main road." "Why didn't you tell the authorities?" Bitter laughter escaped Margaret's lips. "What authorities? The sheriff was Holloway's cousin. When I tried to deliver William's letter to your grandmother as he'd instructed, Jeremiah intercepted me on the road. Threatened to kill my family if I spoke a word." Her voice hardened with decades-old pain. "I was a Mexican woman in a white man's town, Sarah. My word against theirs would have meant nothing, except my death." The confession transformed their partnership. Margaret Hayes was no longer merely a sympathetic ally, but an actual witness to the crime, someone whose testimony could prove crucial in the case against Eagle Ridge's founding families. Dawn brought Agent Carson to the cabin, his usual composure visibly shaken. "There have been developments," he announced without preamble. "Sheriff Holloway and his deputies searched your property yesterday afternoon. They spent particular attention on the well." Sarah's heart sank. "Did they find anything?" "They brought in equipment to drain it completely." Carson's expression darkened. "Holloway claims they found human remains." The news struck like a physical blow. "Daniel Richards?" "Most likely based on the time frame. But there's more. They're claiming the remains prove William Campbell was a murderer, not a victim. That he killed Richards to prevent exposure of his fraudulent land claims, then died in an accident while fleeing justice." The audacity of the lie staggered Sarah. "That's impossible. The documents prove William was the rightful owner. Richards was supporting his claim, not disputing it." "They're counting on controlling the narrative before we can establish the facts," Carson explained. "They've already convened an emergency town meeting to address concerns about Campbell history this afternoon." Professor Wilson, who had arrived shortly after Carson, interjected. "A classic disinformation strategy: establish a false narrative quickly and publicly, making the truth appear to be the revisionist account." Carson nodded grimly. "They're also preparing charges against you, Mrs. Mitchell: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, even potential accessory after the fact in Richard's murder. All baseless, of course, but effective in discrediting you before the truth emerges." Margaret stepped forward, back straight despite her years. "Then it's time I speak about what I witnessed. I've remained silent for 25 years. No more." The revelation of Margaret's true identity stunned both men. Carson recovered first, immediately grasping the significance. "An eyewitness to the original crime changes everything." They formulated a counter-strategy rapidly. Carson would return to Helena to secure federal warrants based on the authenticated documents in Margaret's sworn statement. Wilson would continue gathering corroborating evidence from county records. Sarah and the children would remain hidden until federal authorities could ensure their safety. What no one anticipated was Edward Robertson's next move. As dusk approached, the distant sound of vehicles broke the mountain silence. Margaret's expression turned ashen as she peered through binoculars at the valley below. 3 trucks coming up the fire road. Men with rifles. Carson drew his service weapon. "They shouldn't know about this location." "Someone talked," Margaret said grimly. "Or they followed one of you here." The next hours unfolded in a nightmare of tension. Carson positioned himself at the cabin's only approach, while Wilson helped Sarah prepare the children for possible flight deeper into the forest. Margaret revealed a hidden trapdoor leading to a root cellar barely large enough for Sarah and the children. "My contingency plan," she explained, showing Sarah the narrow tunnel that extended from the cellar toward the creek bed 50 yards away. "I never fully trusted even this hideaway." The sound of men crashing through underbrush grew steadily closer. Sarah hugged her children in the dim light of a single candle beneath the cabin floor, silently promising them safety she couldn't guarantee. Above, she heard Carson's authoritative voice identifying himself as a federal agent, ordering the approaching men to stand down. Gunfire erupted, shattering the mountain stillness. Bullets splintered the cabin's thin walls. David sobbed against Sarah's chest while Emma maintained an unnatural silence, her small body rigid with terror. The root cellar offered protection from the bullets, but would become a trap if discovered. The shooting subsided briefly. Through the floorboards, Sarah heard Carson's labored breathing. "Wilson, get down!" More gunfire, then the unmistakable sound of breaking glass, a bottle smashing against the cabin's outer wall. Seconds later, the acrid smell of smoke filtered through the cracks around the trapdoor. "They're burning us out," Margaret whispered. Sarah could barely make out her face in the dim light, but her voice carried decades of pent-up fury. Just like cowards always do when direct confrontation fails. Heat intensified above them as flames engulfed the small cabin. Smoke began seeping into their shelter, prompting David's coughing. Sarah made a desperate decision. "We have to use the tunnel," she urged, guiding the children toward the narrow opening Margaret had revealed. "Emma, you go first. Keep your brother moving, no matter what." The passage proved brutally tight, designed for emergency escape rather than comfort. Sarah pushed the children ahead, her shoulders scraping raw against rough-hewn timbers. Behind her, Margaret struggled to follow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Leave me," the older woman wheezed. "I'll only slow you down." "No one gets left behind," Sarah insisted, helping Margaret past a particularly narrow section. "We all reach safety, or none of us do." The tunnel's exit emerged beneath a tangle of blackberry bushes near the creek bed. Sarah peered cautiously through the foliage before guiding the children into the open. The night sky glowed orange from the cabin fire on the ridge above them. Voices echoed through the forest, searchers spreading out, hunting for escapees. Sarah led them downstream, using the water to mask their tracks and scent. Emma maintained remarkable composure, holding David's hand and helping him navigate the slippery creek bed. Margaret followed more slowly, determination overcoming physical limitations. They traveled through the darkness, guided only by starlight and the necessity of distance. When David finally stumbled from exhaustion, Sarah carried him, muscles screaming in protest, but maternal instinct providing impossible strength. Dawn found them miles from the burning cabin, huddled in a natural depression beneath an overhanging rock. No pursuit had materialized, whether because their trail had been successfully obscured or because the attackers believed them dead in the fire remained uncertain. "We need to reach the county seat," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. Carson would have left copies of the evidence there with the U.S. Marshal's office as standard procedure. Sarah nodded, calculating options with growing desperation. They couldn't risk the roads, where Holloway's men would surely be watching. Yet the wilderness route would be brutally challenging, particularly for the children and Margaret. "There's another way," Margaret offered after contemplation. "The old mining trail through Blackwater Canyon. It adds miles but keeps us completely off any patrolled routes." Their journey became a brutal test of endurance. The children's initial resilience gave way to exhaustion, then a kind of numb determination that worried Sarah more than complaints would have. They moved primarily at night, resting in concealed locations during daylight hours. Food consisted of whatever Margaret could forage: berries, edible roots, even trout caught by hand in shallow pools. On the third day, Emma spotted smoke from a campfire in the distance. Sarah approached cautiously, prepared to retreat at the first sign of danger. Instead, she found Professor Wilson himself, accompanied by a half-dozen armed men wearing Deputy U.S. Marshal badges. The reunion brought tears and explanations. Carson had survived the ambush with a shoulder wound, managing to reach his vehicle and alert federal authorities before seeking medical attention. The Marshal's office had immediately dispatched a search party, using Wilson's knowledge of their likely route to establish interception points. "The entire county's in turmoil," Wilson explained as a medic examined Margaret's smoke-damaged lungs. "News of the attack on a federal agent spread quickly. State police have established checkpoints on all major roads. The governor himself has demanded answers." "What about Holloway and the others?" Sarah asked, accepting a blanket wrapped around her shoulders by one of the deputies. "Richard Holloway, Edward Robertson, and Gerald Pierce were arrested this morning, attempting to cross the state line into Idaho," Wilson reported with satisfaction. "The sheriff remains at large, but every law enforcement agency in 3 states is hunting him." The news should have brought relief, yet Sarah felt only numb exhaustion, her body and mind too depleted for genuine emotion. She watched her children accept food from kind-faced strangers, their small frames diminished by ordeal, yet somehow stronger in spirit than before. "We found something else at your property," Wilson added quietly, his expression grave. After securing the scene, federal technicians conducted a thorough examination of the well. The remains weren't alone down there. Sarah met his gaze, somehow already knowing what he would say. A metal box containing additional documents was concealed in a second chamber, deeper than where you found William's cache. Letters between the conspirators, detailed plans for fabricating evidence against your grandfather if he pursued legal action, even a crude map marking the ambush location. Wilson shook his head in disbelief. They documented their own conspiracy in meticulous detail, then hid it in the last place anyone would look, the victim's own property. "Arrogance," Margaret interjected, her voice raspy but firm. "They believed themselves untouchable, beyond consequences. What need to destroy evidence when no one would dare investigate?" The journey to the county seat proceeded with military precision, the marshal's men forming a protective cordon around Sarah and the children. News of their survival had evidently spread. Townspeople lined the streets as they passed through, expressions ranging from shock to shame to relief. At the courthouse, Sarah found Agent Carson with his arm in a sling, directing operations from an improvised command center. The evidence she and Margaret had preserved had been supplemented by records seized from Holloway Mining company offices and the personal residences of all three families. The conspiracy extended far beyond the original murder and land theft, Carson explained, indicating a wall covered in photographs and documents. "We've uncovered evidence of systematic corruption spanning decades: tax fraud, jury tampering, witness intimidation. The foundations of Eagle Ridge were built on criminality so pervasive it became normalized." In a quieter moment, as the children slept under guard in an adjoining room, Sarah confronted the question that had haunted her since discovering William's hidden documents. "Did my grandmother know about the silver, the murder, any of it?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "William kept Helen ignorant of the silver discovery, believing it would protect her. After his death, I tried to tell her the truth, but fear overwhelmed her. She chose escape over justice, a choice I understood, even as I made the opposite decision. And my mother, Elizabeth? Too young to understand fully, Helen raised her to fear Eagle Ridge, to never speak of William or their former life. Protection through silence and distance." Margaret's expression softened. "She would be proud of your courage, Sarah. You've finished what William started, bringing truth into the light after decades of darkness." The county courthouse transformed into a hub of activity as federal and state authorities established a joint task force to process the expanding case. Judge Richard Parker, a federal jurist with a reputation for incorruptibility, arrived from Helena to oversee preliminary hearings. Sarah provided formal testimony, presenting William's documents and recounting her investigation with a clarity that belied her recent ordeal. Margaret's eyewitness account of the original murder proved devastating, her detailed description of the ambush matching precisely with physical evidence recovered from the site 25 years later. 3 days into the proceedings, William Holloway was captured, attempting to charter a private plane to Canada. His subsequent interrogation yielded additional confessions, as he attempted to trade information for leniency. The web of corruption extended beyond the three primary families to include county officials, banking regulators, and even a former state representative. Judge Parker, after reviewing the evidence regarding the original land theft, issued a preliminary ruling that sent shockwaves through Eagle Ridge. Based on authenticated documentation and corroborating testimony, this court recognizes the legitimacy of William Campbell's original land grant. All subsequent transfers predicated on fraudulent claims are hereby invalidated pending final determination. The legal implications were staggering. Sarah and her children stood to inherit not just their small parcel, but significant portions of Eagle Ridge itself, including the still productive silver mine that had motivated the original conspiracy. That evening, as Sarah sat on the courthouse steps watching the sunset paint the mountains in crimson and gold, she felt no triumph, only a profound weariness. Emma approached cautiously, sitting beside her mother in companionable silence, before finally asking the question that had clearly troubled her. Will we take their houses, Mom? Like they took Grandpa William's land? The innocent question crystallized the moral complexity Sarah had been avoiding. Legal victory would displace dozens of families, most innocent of the original crimes, having purchased homes and businesses in good faith from the conspirators or their descendants. What would be just isn't always what's right, Sarah replied, putting her arm around Emma's shoulders. Your grandfather wanted the land for his family's security, not to cause others pain. Emma considered this with the solemn thoughtfulness that increasingly reminded Sarah of Thomas. Dad always said the measure of a person isn't what they take, but what they give. Later that night, Sarah requested a private meeting with Judge Parker, Professor Wilson, and Agent Carson. Her proposal was unprecedented, but rooted in a vision of justice broader than mere legal victory. I want to establish a trust, she explained, spreading a hastily drawn map across the conference table. The Campbell Family Trust would retain title to the lands legally restored to us, but current residents and businesses would maintain occupancy rights through long-term leases at nominal rates. Judge Parker raised skeptical eyebrows. You'd surrender millions in potential compensation? Not surrender, redirect, Sarah clarified. The silver mine revenues would fund community development, a proper school, a hospital, infrastructure improvements. Eagle Ridge would transform from a town built on corruption to one founded on community benefit. The judge studied her with newfound respect. An unusual approach to restitution, Mrs. Mitchell. The court cannot compel such generosity. This isn't about generosity, Sarah replied with quiet conviction. It's about breaking cycles. The original theft poisoned this community for generations. Simply reversing ownership would perpetuate division, not heal it. Professor Wilson nodded thoughtfully. Transformative justice rather than mere punitive measures. Quite revolutionary for a legal system typically focused on winners and losers. 2 weeks later, as preliminary hearings concluded with indictments against 27 individuals connected to the conspiracy, Sarah presented her proposal formally before the Eagle Ridge community. The town hall, the only venue large enough to accommodate the entire population, filled beyond capacity, anxiety palpable among people whose futures hung in the balance. Sarah stood alone at the podium, conscious of every eye upon her, of the whispered conversations that ceased as she prepared to speak. Emma and David watched from front row seats beside Margaret, their expressions a mixture of pride and apprehension. My grandfather came to Montana seeking not wealth, but a legacy for his family, Sarah began, her voice gaining strength with each word. The silver beneath this land was unexpected bounty, but William Campbell measured value in generations, not dollars. What was stolen from him, from us, was not merely property, but possibility. She paused, surveying the assembled faces, shopkeepers, ranchers, miners, families whose roots in Eagle Ridge reached back decades, all now confronting the possibility of displacement through no fault of their own. Justice that creates new victims is no justice at all. The declaration hung in the air, unexpected from someone who had every legal right to demand restitution. The Campbell Family Trust will hold title to lands rightfully ours, but its purpose is restoration, not retribution. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Sarah outlined her vision: security for current residents, community ownership of the mine's proceeds, development projects to benefit all citizens. Initial disbelief gave way to cautious hope as people recognized an offer of reconciliation where they had expected eviction. This town was built on a foundation of lies, Sarah concluded, her gaze steady across the assembled faces. Together, we have the opportunity to rebuild it on truth, not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging it honestly and choosing a different path forward. My grandfather's legacy should be community, not division, prosperity shared rather than prosperity stolen. The silence following her words stretched uncomfortably before being broken by an unexpected source. Frank Turner, the rancher who had helped fight the fire at her cabin. He stood slowly, hat clutched in weathered hands. My father bought our land from Holloway in '32, he admitted, voice carrying in the hushed room. Always told me it was a fair deal. Now I learn differently. His shoulders straightened with decision. If the Campbell Trust will have me, I'd be proud to serve on its board. Someone ought to represent the working folks who've built lives here, good faith or not. Others joined him, Martha Jenkins offering commercial expertise, the young school teacher volunteering educational insight, even the bank's assistant manager stepping forward to provide financial guidance. The foundation of a new Eagle Ridge taking shape before Sarah's eyes, built not on her authority, but on shared commitment. As the meeting concluded, people approached Sarah individually, some offering apologies for their silence during her ostracism, others expressing gratitude for her unexpected mercy, a few simply nodding acknowledgement of a new beginning. The wall between outsider and townsfolk, crumbling not through conquest, but through compassion. That evening, as Sarah tucked her children into beds at the hotel that had become their temporary home, Emma's perceptive question cut to the heart of the day's events. "Are we staying in Eagle Ridge now, Mom, for good?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, considering the weight of the decision. "I think we are. Not because it's easy, but because it's where we're needed." She thought of the trust board's first meeting scheduled for tomorrow, of the former conspirators awaiting trial, of a community simultaneously confronting its past and reimagining its future. Sometimes home isn't where you're from, but where you choose to make a difference. Later, standing at the hotel window overlooking the town square, Sarah watched moonlight illuminate the mountains that had witnessed both the original crime and its unfolding resolution. The silver that had motivated murder now promised healing, wealth transformed from private corruption to public benefit. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Agent Carson stood in the hallway, his expression troubled despite the day's apparent triumph. "We've received intelligence that concerns me," he said without preamble. "William Holloway has escaped custody during transport to the federal detention facility in Helena. 2 marshals were injured." The news sent ice through Sarah's veins. The sheriff, most volatile of the conspirators and most directly implicated in recent violence, was now desperate, hunted, and undoubtedly furious about the day's developments. "We're implementing additional security measures," Carson continued, "but I felt you should know personally." He made statements during his brief incarceration that suggested particular animosity toward you and your children. Sarah's mind raced through implications and contingencies. The trust announcement had transformed potential enemies into allies throughout Eagle Ridge, but William Holloway represented a different category of threat, a cornered man with nothing left to lose. "The children don't leave my sight," she stated, maternal instinct crystallizing into absolute resolve. "And we accelerate the legal proceedings securing the trust. If anything happens to me, the children's inheritance must be protected by irrevocable structures." Carson nodded solemnly. "Judge Parker has already assigned round-the-clock protection. We'll find Holloway." After he departed, Sarah returned to the window, scanning the shadows with new wariness. The path to justice had never promised safety, only necessity. William Campbell had died protecting what belonged to future generations. She would not fail to complete what he had begun. The moon continued its silent journey across the sky, illuminating an Eagle Ridge poised between past and future. In the silver mine that had sparked deadly greed 25 years earlier, night shift workers extracted ore that would now benefit the entire community. In the courthouse, federal agents processed evidence that would hold the guilty accountable while sparing innocent families. And in a hotel room at the center of town, Sarah Mitchell kept watch through the night, guardian not just of her sleeping children, but of a vision for justice larger than revenge, more enduring than punishment, and ultimately more powerful than the corruption it would replace. Eagle Ridge transformed with the changing seasons, summer's heat giving way to autumn's crisp clarity. 3 months had passed since the Campbell Family Trust establishment, and signs of renewal spread throughout the town like ripples across still water. Construction crews worked steadily on the new schoolhouse, its foundation already laid where once stood an abandoned warehouse. The hospital renovation had begun on the eastern edge of town, converting a former Holloway mining administrative building into a medical facility that would serve communities throughout the county. Sarah walked Main Street with a sense of cautious satisfaction, nodding to townspeople who now greeted her with genuine warmth rather than suspicious glances. The trust board met weekly in the refurbished town hall, their discussions evolving from emergency stabilization to long-term planning. Frank Turner had proven an unexpected ally, his practical wisdom balancing Sarah's idealism with achievable timelines and priorities. Yet beneath this progress, unease persisted. William Holloway remained at large despite an intensive manhunt spanning 3 states. Reported sightings, a man matching his description in a Billings diner, a suspicious figure watching the Campbell property from distant ridgelines, kept federal agents combing the mountains while Sarah maintained constant vigilance over her children. Mrs. Mitchell, Martha Jenkins, emerged from the general store, her customary reserve now tempered with respectful familiarity. The school supplies you ordered from Chicago arrived on this morning's train. Primer books, slates, chalk, everything on your list. Thank you, Martha. Sarah examined the shipping manifest, mentally calculating how many additional desks they would need before winter classes could begin. Has there been any word about the science equipment? Delayed in Denver, I'm afraid. Railroad strike affecting shipments across Colorado. Martha hesitated, lowering her voice. There's something else. A man was asking about you yesterday. Stranger, not from these parts. Asked about your routine when you visit the construction sites. Sarah's muscles tensed involuntarily. Did you get a description? Middle-aged, well-dressed, claimed to be an investor interested in the trust's development projects. Martha's expression conveyed her skepticism. Philip at the hotel says he paid cash, gave no proper name, and left before dawn. These subtle threats had become routine. Potential sightings of Holloway, suspicious strangers making inquiries, unmarked vehicles observed on remote roads near Campbell Land. Whether genuine danger or merely echoes of trauma, they maintained a constant undercurrent of anxiety beneath Sarah's carefully constructed composure. Agent Carson, though officially reassigned to Helena, made weekly visits to Eagle Ridge. His assessment remained unchanged. Holloway is too smart to leave the region entirely. He knows these mountains better than our trackers, has connections throughout the territory. What sustains a man in hiding for months? Sarah had asked during Carson's last visit, watching Emma and David play in the fenced yard behind their newly renovated home. The original Campbell cabin, now restored with modern conveniences and additional rooms for the growing trust operations. Carson's expression had darkened. Hate is a powerful motivator, Mrs. Mitchell. It can sustain a man longer than food or water. His usual professional distance had slipped momentarily. People like William Holloway don't simply accept defeat. In their minds, personal failure isn't possible. Therefore, someone else must be responsible for their downfall. This conversation haunted Sarah as she continued down Main Street, automatically scanning rooftops, alleyways, and passing vehicles with the hypervigilance that had become second nature. The children remained under guard at school, federal marshals maintaining discreet protective details that had become so familiar the students had nicknamed them shadow teachers. Sarah reached the courthouse where Judge Parker maintained temporary chambers while overseeing the complex legal proceedings against the conspiracy's participants. The trials had begun with minor figures, clerks who had falsified records, deputies who had intimidated witnesses, working gradually toward the principal architects. Richard Holloway and Edward Robertson faced their sentencing tomorrow, having negotiated guilty pleas in exchange for testimony against others. The excavation team made another discovery at the well site, Judge Parker announced without preamble as Sarah entered his office. The federal jurists had abandoned some formalities during their frequent consultations, recognizing their shared commitment to resolving Eagle Ridge's tangled legal challenges. Ground-penetrating radar indicated an anomaly beneath the original chamber. They've recovered additional remains. Sarah sank into the offered chair, the implications washing over her. More victims? 2 sets of remains, both male, both showing evidence of violent death. Parker slid a preliminary forensic report across his desk. Based on artifacts recovered, a pocket watch, personal effects, one appears to be James Campbell, William's brother, who supposedly left for California in 1926. The revelation struck Sarah like physical impact. Another family member lost to the conspiracy, another thread in the tapestry of deception that had shrouded Eagle Ridge for generations. Who was the second victim? Identification is preliminary, but evidence suggests Henry Blackwood, a federal mining inspector dispatched to survey the region in 1929. Parker's expression hardened. His final report was never filed. The Department of Interior recorded him as having resigned his position unexpectedly. Each discovery expanded the conspiracy's scope, revealing a ruthlessness exceeding even Sarah's darkest suspicions. The Holloway, Robertson, and Pierce families hadn't simply stolen land through opportunistic fraud. They had systematically eliminated anyone threatening their operations over a period of years. "Does this change the legal proceedings?" Sarah asked, mind racing through implications. "It elevates the charges against all principals to first-degree murder in multiple cases, conspiracy across state lines, interference with federal officials." Parker removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "More practically, it confirms your decision regarding the trust was prescient. These crimes extend far beyond the three families. Their tendrils reach through Eagle Ridge's entire founding narrative." Sarah left the courthouse with the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square, where workers were installing a new bandstand funded by the Trust's first community improvement grant. Children played nearby, their laughter a counterpoint to the grim revelations occupying her thoughts. She barely registered the figure approaching until he stood directly in her path. Thomas Pierce, youngest son of Gerald Pierce, his eyes hollow with a combination of grief and bewilderment that had become common among family members of the accused. "My father claims he was forced to participate," Thomas blurted, without greeting. His voice carried the ragged edge of someone struggling to reconcile lifelong beliefs with devastating contradictions. "Says Holloway threatened our family if he didn't cooperate in covering up what happened to William Campbell." Sarah studied the young man whose world had collapsed with each new revelation. Unlike his father and uncles, Thomas had cooperated immediately with investigators, providing family documents that proved crucial to understanding the conspiracy's evolution. "The evidence suggests your father made choices, Thomas. Difficult ones, perhaps under pressure, but choices nonetheless." Sarah maintained compassionate firmness, having navigated similar conversations with numerous family members seeking exemption from collective guilt. "The trust isn't interested in punishing children for parents' sins. Your position at the sawmill remains secure." Thomas's shoulders slumped with conflicting relief and shame. "I keep thinking about what it must have been like, growing up believing one version of your family's history, then discovering everything was built on lies." "It's never too late to choose a different path," Sarah offered, the phrase emerging from some wellspring of wisdom she hadn't known she possessed. "Eagle Ridge's future doesn't need to be imprisoned by its past." This philosophy guided the Trust's operations as autumn deepened toward winter. While legal proceedings addressed historical crimes, Sarah focused increasingly on forward-looking initiatives, educational opportunities, infrastructure development, community healing. The silver mine operated at full capacity under new management, its revenues funding everything from road improvements to a scholarship program for local students. Emma and David thrived despite the background tension. Emma displayed unexpected aptitude for mathematics, spending hours with Professor Wilson during his extended residency documenting Eagle Ridge's transformation. David revealed artistic talent reminiscent of Thomas's, capturing Montana's rugged landscapes in charcoal sketches that demonstrated remarkable perception for a 6-year-old. The sentencing hearing for Richard Holloway and Edward Robertson drew citizens from throughout the county. Sarah attended with reluctance, having little desire to witness even justified punishment, but recognizing her presence's symbolic importance. Judge Parker delivered justice with solemn authority, 25 years imprisonment for each man, their considerable assets forfeited to a victim compensation fund separate from the trust. Neither man acknowledged Sarah directly, though Robertson's shoulders hunched with what might have been remorse as the marshals led him away. Richard Holloway maintained rigid composure, his aristocratic features frozen in contempt for proceedings he clearly considered beneath his dignity. Outside the courthouse, Agent Carson approached with the grim satisfaction of a professional witnessing justice served. 2 down, 1 still at large. "Any progress tracking William Holloway?" Sarah asked, watching Emma and David where they waited with their protective detail. "He's received assistance, supplies, transportation, possibly weapons. Family loyalty extends beyond those directly implicated." Carson's frustration showed through his professional veneer. "We've established roadblocks along every exit route from the county, but these mountains contain 1,000 hiding places for someone who knows them well." That evening, as Sarah supervised the children's bedtime routine in their renovated cabin, Margaret arrived unexpectedly, her expression troubled in ways that immediately triggered Sarah's internal alarms. "There's been activity at the old Hayes property," Margaret explained once the children were asleep. The remote cabin where she had lived as Margaret Hayes before assuming her teaching identity had remained abandoned for decades, its existence nearly forgotten except by those with direct connection to William Campbell's era. "What kind of activity?" "Lights last night, smoke from the chimney." Margaret's hands twisted anxiously in her lap. "Only a few people even remember that place exists." The implication hung between them, a hiding place known only to those connected with Eagle Ridge's earliest days, remote enough to evade conventional searches, yet close enough to observe the town's activities. The ideal shelter for William Holloway. Sarah contacted Agent Carson immediately. By midnight, federal marshals had established surveillance positions surrounding the Hayes property, their approach slowed by the need for absolute stealth across difficult terrain. Sarah insisted on accompanying them despite Carson's vehement objections. "This began with my family and should end with my witness," she stated with quiet determination. "I won't interfere with the arrest, but I need to see this concluded." Dawn broke across the eastern ridges as their small party reached observation position overlooking the dilapidated cabin. Through binoculars, Sarah could discern fresh repairs to the roof, newly cut firewood stacked beside the porch. Someone had indeed been using the shelter recently. "Movement inside," whispered the marshal beside her, a specialist in wilderness operations whose camouflage form blended seamlessly with the underbrush. "Single occupant, armed, matches Holloway's description." Carson coordinated the approach through hand signals, positioning agents to cover all potential escape routes before initiating contact. Sarah remained at the observation point, heart pounding against her ribs as the operation unfolded with methodical precision. The federal announcement, clear, authoritative commands to surrender, mirrored the morning stillness. Seconds stretched into minutes with no response from within the cabin. Carson signaled again, and agents advanced in practice formation toward the structure. Gunfire erupted from a rear window, desperate, poorly aimed shots that splintered tree trunks and ricocheted off rocks. The marshals returned disciplined fire, focusing on containment rather than direct confrontation. "William Holloway, you're surrounded by federal agents," Carson's voice carried across the clearing. "Surrender your weapon and exit with your hands visible." More gunfire answered, followed by sudden movement at the cabin's side door. A figure burst outside, firing wildly while sprinting toward the dense forest beyond. Sarah recognized William Holloway instantly, despite his unkempt appearance. Thinner, bearded, but with the same arrogant bearing evident even in desperate flight. Marshals closed the gap with remarkable speed. Holloway managed perhaps 30 yards before being tackled to the ground, his weapon skittering across rocks as agents secured his wrists with practiced efficiency. His stream of obscenities and threats continued unabated during the arrest process, coherent threats dissolving into primal rage as he was led toward the transport vehicles. Holloway spotted Sarah observing from the ridgeline, his expression transformed, hatred crystallizing into something beyond mere anger, a fundamental rejection of reality itself. "This isn't over, Mitchell." His voice cracked with strain as agents urged him forward. "You think some trust can erase what this town is? What it was built on? We made something from nothing. You're just giving it away." Sarah watched silently as Holloway disappeared into the armored transport. The last architect of her grandfather's murder, the final participant in a conspiracy spanning generations, reduced to impotent threats shouted across mountain air. "It's finished," Carson stated simply, joining her at the observation point. 3 months of searching, dozens of false leads, and he was hiding barely 10 miles from town the entire time. Sarah felt no triumph, no vindication, only a profound weariness mingled with tentative relief. Will it ever really be finished? The impact of what they did can't be undone with arrests and trials. Carson considered this with professional detachment, softened by genuine respect. "Justice isn't about erasing harm, Mrs. Mitchell. It's about acknowledging it officially, creating consequences, and establishing foundations for whatever healing might be possible." Holloway's capture dominated conversation throughout Eagle Ridge for weeks afterward. His trial proceeded swiftly, the evidence overwhelming and his own courtroom behavior increasingly erratic. Judge Parker sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, noting that the combined charges would have justified capital punishment in most jurisdictions. As winter settled across Montana, blanketing Eagle Ridge in pristine snow, Sarah found herself increasingly preoccupied with the trust's future rather than the town's past. The new school opened its doors despite ongoing interior construction. 63 students filling classrooms with energy and possibility. The hospital welcomed its first patients, bringing medical care previously available only through arduous journeys to Helena or Bozeman. "We've accomplished the impossible in less than 6 months," Frank Turner commented during a trust board meeting as they reviewed completed projects and pending initiatives. His weathered face, once guarded in Sarah's presence, now showed genuine admiration. "Most folks thought you'd sell everything and leave once the trials ended." "Eagle Ridge isn't just a place my family owned," Sarah replied, studying the community development maps spread across the conference table. "It's where my children are building their lives, where my grandfather's vision can finally take root." Christmas transformed the town square into a wonderland of lights and greenery. Community celebrations, replacing the factionalism that had previously defined social interactions. The Campbell Cabin hosted an open house that drew visitors from throughout the region, curious to see both the historical structure and its restoration under trust management. Emma and David thrived in this new environment, making friends among children who had once been instructed to avoid them. Emma's academic achievements earned recognition from the State Education Board, while David's artistic talents garnered attention from visitors who commissioned landscape paintings despite his young age. Yet beneath this progress, Sarah remained haunted by deeper questions about healing and responsibility. The legal proceedings had established accountability for specific crimes, but the broader legacy, a community founded on theft, murder, and deliberate erasure of truth, required more nuanced reconciliation. This challenge crystallized unexpectedly through Daniel Richards' remains. The notary murdered and hidden in William Campbell's well after witnessing the fraudulent documents required proper burial. But where? With no surviving family to claim him, the decision fell to Sarah as property owner. "He deserves recognition beyond evidence in a criminal case," Sarah told Professor Wilson as they discussed options. "His death wasn't an unfortunate detail in our family's story. It was a human life deliberately extinguished for standing by the truth." This conversation sparked what would become the Eagle Ridge Memorial Garden, established on a sunlit meadow where William Campbell's original homestead had stood. Simple stone markers commemorated each victim identified during the investigation. William Campbell, Daniel Richards, James Campbell, Henry Blackwood, and 2 unidentified individuals whose remains suggested Native American origin, likely predating even the Campbell settlement. The memorial dedication, held on a crisp February morning, drew hundreds from throughout the county. Sarah had invited representatives from the Blackfeet Nation, acknowledging that all current claims to the land existed within the context of earlier displacement. Their attendance and blessing of the site added profound resonance to a ceremony bridging multiple historical injustices. "This memorial doesn't erase what happened," Sarah told the gathered community, her voice carrying across the silent meadow. "These markers represent not just those who died, but the corruption that their deaths made possible. By acknowledging them openly, we reclaim the power of truth that others tried to bury alongside them." Margaret Hayes Taylor, now publicly reconciled with both identities, placed the first ceremonial flowers on William Campbell's marker. "We honor not just those who died, but those who carried truth through difficult years," Sarah continued, watching the elderly woman whose dual existence had preserved crucial testimony. "Sometimes courage means survival when everything around you demands silence." Spring brought new beginnings, literal and symbolic. The Campbell Trust established its permanent headquarters in the renovated Eagle Ridge Hotel, its mission expanding beyond immediate community needs to regional historical reconciliation efforts. Professor Wilson accepted a permanent position documenting the Trust's work, establishing an archive preserving both the conspiracy's evidence and the community's healing process. On a warm April afternoon, as Sarah reviewed architectural plans for the town's expanded library, Emma burst into her office with unprecedented excitement. "Mom, they found another box in the well." The excavation team had continued systematic documentation of the site for both forensic and historical purposes. Their latest discovery, a metal container sealed within the well's deepest stonework, contained not evidence of additional crimes but something far more personal. William Campbell's private correspondence, photographs, and journal entries from his earliest days in Montana. Sarah sat in the trust library late into the night, poring over her grandfather's personal reflections, his hopes for the land, his dreams for his family's future, his observations about Montana's rugged beauty. Unlike the practical documents hidden for legal protection, these papers revealed William Campbell's soul, his vision extending far beyond mere property ownership. "I build not just for myself, but for generations yet unborn," William had written in 1926. "This land offers not merely resources to extract, but a foundation for community, where justice and opportunity might flourish equally for all who contribute their labor and spirit." These words, written nearly 30 years before Sarah's birth, aligned so perfectly with the Trust's mission that she wept upon reading them. William's vision, temporarily buried by violence and corruption, had germinated in darkness like a persistent seed, finally emerging into sunlight through his granddaughter's unwitting continuation of his deepest values. Sarah shared these discoveries with Emma and David the following evening, spreading photographs across their dining table. William and Helen on their wedding day, baby Elizabeth cradled in proud arms, the original homestead under construction, with neighbors helping raise the roof beams. "He looks like David," Emma observed, studying William's features in the sepia images. "Same eyes, same smile." "And you have his determination," Sarah replied, watching her daughter carefully organize the materials in chronological order without being asked. "He would be so proud of both of you." This connection across generations provided healing Sarah hadn't realized she needed. William Campbell transformed from abstract victim to flesh and blood ancestor, his personality emerging through handwritten pages expressing the same hopes, frustrations, and dreams that occupied her own thoughts. Summer marked the one-year anniversary of their arrival in Eagle Ridge. The town had transformed almost beyond recognition. New construction, renovated historic buildings, streets busy with purpose rather than suspicion. The population had grown as the Trust's initiatives attracted professionals previously unavailable in remote Montana communities. Doctors for the new hospital, specialized teachers for expanded educational programs. On the anniversary day itself, Sarah took the children to the memorial garden, now flourishing with native wildflowers and young trees. They placed fresh flowers on William's marker, then hiked to the ridge overlooking the entire valley, the perspective from which Sarah had first viewed their inheritance a year earlier. "When we first came here, I thought this was the end of our story," Sarah told Emma and David as they shared a picnic lunch in the mountain sunshine. "I was wrong. It was just the beginning of something much larger than ourselves." Emma, perceptive as always, caught the deeper meaning in her mother's reflection. Like Grandpa William's secret in the well, he thought he was hiding something, but he was really saving it for when it would matter most. Exactly. Sarah watched a hawk circle lazily on thermal currents above the valley. Some truths wait patiently until the world is ready to hear them. The Campbell Trust's work continued expanding through the years that followed. Sarah declined numerous opportunities to leave Eagle Ridge, job offers from Helena, Denver, even Washington, D.C., choosing instead to build upon the foundation she had discovered buried beneath decades of deception. Emma eventually attended law school, specializing in land rights cases for historically dispossessed communities across the American West. David's artistic talents led him to architecture, designing structures that honored both Montana's natural beauty and its complex human history. On a crisp autumn day in '99, 44 years after Sarah first stood before the dilapidated cabin, a dedication ceremony unveiled Eagle Ridge's newest community institution, the Campbell Historical Center. The renovated well stood at its heart, preserved beneath a protective glass structure, allowing visitors to view the chamber where truth had waited patiently for discovery. Sarah, now 79 with silver hair and the same determined eyes, cut the ceremonial ribbon before a crowd spanning generations of Eagle Ridge residents. Many were descendants of those involved in the original conspiracy. Others had arrived during the community's renaissance. But all shared the benefits of transformation begun when one woman refused to accept comfortable lies. History isn't merely what happened, Sarah told the assembled citizens, her voice still clear despite her years. It's what we choose to remember, acknowledge, and learn from. This center exists not to assign blame, but to prevent forgiveness without truth, reconciliation without accountability. The center's exhibits told Eagle Ridge's complete story. The original Blackfeet inhabitants, William Campbell's homesteading vision, the silver discovery, the murders and conspiracy, decades of suppressed truth, and finally the community's rebirth through confrontation with its own past. Most powerful was this final exhibit, a simple glass case containing the wooden box Sarah had discovered in the well 44 years earlier. Beside it, photographs documented Eagle Ridge's evolution, the new school graduating its first college-bound seniors, the hospital saving lives previously lost to distance, community celebrations bringing together families once divided by secrets. As visitors explored the center on its opening day, Emma, now a distinguished attorney with silver threading her dark hair, joined her mother beside the preserved well. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken Holloway's offer that first week? $25,000 and a clean escape from all this? Sarah considered the alternate history with a slight smile. We would have survived, perhaps even prospered somewhere else, but this land would have remained poisoned by buried truth, and the healing that's happened here would have waited for someone else's courage. Or never happened at all, Emma added softly. They watched as school children gathered around a guide explaining the well's significance, young faces serious with attention to a history now openly discussed, rather than whispered about. The truth doesn't need defenders as much as it needs witnesses, Sarah observed, wisdom accumulated through decades of community healing. People willing to look directly at both beauty and ugliness without turning away. As afternoon light filtered through the center's skylights, illuminating the preserved well in golden radiance, Sarah recognized William Campbell's ultimate victory. The silver that had motivated his murder had funded not personal wealth, but community transformation. The land stolen through violence had become a foundation for justice rather than exploitation. The truth buried in darkness had emerged into light, not as weapon, but as medicine. Eagle Ridge had been built twice, first on lies that inevitably crumbled, then on truth that continued growing stronger with each passing year. The well that had preserved secrets through decades of darkness now stood in perpetual light, its stones witnessing a community's journey from conspiracy to reconciliation, from corruption to common purpose. Sarah placed her hand on the protective glass, feeling connection across time to her grandfather, whose vision had waited patiently beneath the earth for someone brave enough to bring it into sunlight. Some treasures, she whispered to his memory, are measured not in silver, but in truth.